In the heart of Umuroko town, where modern skyscrapers kissed the clouds but ancestral whispers still wandered through the alleys. Three friends lived wildly different lives but shared one unbreakable bond. Sefa, the fashion designer with a sharp tongue and louder heels, ran her boutique near the central roundabout. Daimji, the quiet IT genius who preferred to speak through screens, rented a flat above a dusty internet cafe. Then there was Karabo, a fitness trainer whose energy could light up the entire town square. They met every Friday evening at a rooftop lounge on Asaba Street, a place that played old Afrobeat vinyls and smelled like grilled pepper chicken. One Friday, a white envelope arrived at their table without a sender. It was black and gold, shimmering, handwritten in calligraphy that looked too elegant for the street it came from. You are invited to the Midnight Harvester rare gathering of power, pleasure, and prestige. It read. Time, midnight, location, Hush Gardens, behind the Abano Hotel. The three friends laughed, thinking it was some elite club's gimmick, but something in the scent of the envelope, some strange iron-like tang, gave Karabo a chill he couldn't explain. That night, the streets of Umuroko glowed under flickering street lamps, but Hush Gardens remained unnaturally dark. When they arrived, everything felt wrong yet luxurious. The gates opened silently to reveal a lavishly decorated courtyard, with floating candles in red bowls, tables made of polished bone-white marble, and guests in velvet cloaks who never showed their faces. A tall woman with gold tattoos welcomed them with a bow and handed each of them a black glass of sparkling crimson drink. The liquid bubbled like it was alive. Sefa took a sip and smiled. Daimji hesitated but followed her lead, while Karabo only pretended to drink. The host, an old man with silver dreadlocks and no visible pupils, gave a speech about honoring ancient traditions in modern times, claiming the feast would mark their transformation into something beyond humans. Everyone clapped, but the applause echoed with an unnatural rhythm, like something beating beneath the floorboards. Behind the laughter and music, Karabo could feel eyes watching them from the shadows, hungry, calculating eyes. Dinner was served, on golden trays brought by silent staff in masks shaped like lion and hyena skulls. The aroma was intoxicating, meat that smelled richer than goat, yet unfamiliar. Sefa, who never backed down from luxury, dug in first and praised its softness. Daimji, caught between curiosity and pressure, followed. Karabo pretended to chew, but pocketed a piece into a tissue under the table. A violinist played a slow, eerie melody that made the hair on their necks rise. Then the guests began chanting in a language that felt older than the ground itself. The old man stood again, declaring the friends were chosen for sweetness, for courage, and for balance, three qualities needed for the renewal of taste. Karabo's stomach turned. He noticed every other guest hadn't touched the food, only watching them eat. When Sefa complimented the sauce, a guest beside her sniffed deeply, like savoring her scent. Karabo felt trapped, like they were not attendees but ingredients being seasoned. The exit doors vanished. Where they once saw an open gate, now there was just a brick wall covered in vines that pulsed like veins. The staff began clearing plates, without a word, and the guests stood in perfect synchronization as the old man raised his hands. He began chanting, his voice shaking the lantern flames. Daimji suddenly clutched his chest and gasped. His eyes flickered black for a second. Sefa laughed awkwardly, blaming the wine, but her movements were sluggish. Karabo knew then they had been drugged. He grabbed both of them and tried to flee through the back, only to find a spiral staircase leading underground. As they descended, walls grew tighter, the air warmer. A low hum vibrated through their bones. Symbols on the wall glowed red, and drums began beating somewhere deep below. The ceremony had only just begun. Karabo didn't know what they were walking into, but it wasn't a party, it was a hunt, and they were the prize. The spiral staircase beneath Hush Gardens seemed endless, but Karabo kept dragging Sefa and Daimji, both of whom were now barely conscious. The deeper they went, the more the walls shifted from tiled concrete to something that felt like carved flesh. Breathing with every step, dim lights shaped like lanterns flickered from above. But the shadows they cast moved independently, crawling across the walls like living ink. At the base of the stairs, they entered a circular chamber filled with shallow water, ankle-deep and red as rust. In the center stood 3 stone thrones carved with disturbing depictions, one of a woman birthing a goat, another of a man split in half but still smiling, and the third of a child holding a smoking bone. As Karabo stepped closer, the thrones began to whisper in a language he didn't understand, yet felt in his veins. A voice from nowhere boomed, "The trial begins. Your choices will season your souls." A door opened behind them with no visible push, revealing a corridor lined with flickering torches. Karabo knew there was no turning back. The feast had moved underground, and they were being watched more closely now. As they entered the corridor, Karabo felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, like insects marching across his skin. The walls were covered with portraits, hundreds of them all, showing previous guests who had likely attended the midnight harvest. But the eyes in each portrait weren't still. They blinked, followed, even smiled. Some faces were missing mouths, others had multiple tongues. Halfway down the hall, a young man appeared, dressed in modern clothes, holding a silver lantern. He introduced himself not with words, but with an apologetic nod, then turned and beckoned them to follow. Karabo, trusting anything over staying still, supported Daimji with one arm and guided Sepha with the other. The young man led them through a metallic door into a chamber that resembled a butcher's room. There were slabs, hooks, and labeled sections: charisma, obedience, pride. The labels weren't for meats but for people. On the far side, a sink dripped something thick and black, and Karabo noticed a pile of phones and wallets. Their belongings. But how had they gotten here before them? That's when it clicked. This wasn't just a party. It was a ritual, and someone had rehearsed their sacrifice. Suddenly, the lights went out. The silence pressed against them like a second skin. When the emergency torches buzzed back to life, the young man was gone. In his place stood two masked figures, cloaked in crimson and holding curved blades. Sepha collapsed. Daimji, disoriented, began to convulse. Karabo grabbed a broken metal rod from one of the butchering tables and stood in front of them like a shield. The figures didn't speak, but circled slowly, almost lazily, like predators who already knew their prey couldn't escape. Then, the walls pulsed, and chanting returned from unseen speakers: sweetness, courage, balance. Karabo swung wildly when one figure lunged, making contact. The mask cracked beneath it. He saw a face he knew. A woman who used to be a local TV presenter, missing for 2 years. Her eyes were hollow, yet full of ritualistic fire. She hissed and retreated, blood trailing down her chin. The other figure raised a whistle and blew. Doors slammed open, and the sound of more feet echoed toward them. Karabo knew they weren't trying to kill them yet. They were testing flavor, fear, resistance. It wasn't just a hunt. It was preparation. Karabo dragged the others toward the far end, where an air duct hissed behind hanging animal skins. Pulling them through it was a nightmare-tight wet, and filled with the echoes of breathing that didn't belong to them. They emerged into a control room lit with old monitors and buzzing wires. The screens showed every room above and below, Hush Gardens, hundreds of trapped guests. All in different stages of harvest. Some danced in rooms with strange gases, others were fed until they couldn't walk, and some were praying while masked figures observed in silence. Karabo spotted their rooftop table on one screen, untouched drinks still glowing faintly. He realized this wasn't the first midnight harvest, just one of many. Records showed logbooks of names, details, even blood types, and each entry ended with one of two stamps: acceptable or too salty. His stomach clenched. This was industrial cannibalism, ancient rituals dressed in modern luxury. They had to escape, but as he turned to wake Sepha, a hand reached out from behind the server rack, gripping his shoulder hard. When he spun around, it wasn't a hand. It was a claw. The clawed hand yanked Karabo into the server rack's shadow like he weighed nothing, his back slamming into cold wires and buzzing panels. But before he could react, the creature whispered something not in words, but in feeling. It wasn't an attacker. It was a survivor, or what was left of one. Its body was bone-thin, eyes sunken deep, like dried wells, and parts of its skin had hardened like bark. It wasn't born that way. It had been eaten piece by piece, kept alive for ritual purposes. The creature scribbled symbols on the dusty floor, outlining an exit route Karabo barely understood, and pointed toward a red-levered door beside the monitors. Karabo thanked it with a nod, even as the clawed survivor pulled itself back into the cables like a ghost, disappearing into the wires that once recorded deaths. Time was running out. He scooped up Sepha, who mumbled names from her dreams, and shook Daimji awake. But Daimji's eyes weren't the same. They were turning black again, and his teeth looked longer. Whatever poison they'd been fed, it wasn't just to sedate. It was transforming them. He couldn't leave Daimji behind, but he also couldn't trust him completely. That was the cruelty of this feast. It didn't just consume bodies, it devoured friendships, loyalty, and memory. Through the red door, They emerged into what looked like a theater, a circular chamber with tiered stone seating, but instead of a stage, there was a pit filled with sand and bones. Dozens of masked guests stood above, staring silently. Then, a horn blew. A spotlight flickered on, and a voice called their names, echoing through the chamber. Sepha, of desire; Daimji, of silence; Caribou, of spirit. One by one, they were pushed forward into the pit by invisible force. The sand was warm, almost too warm, and the air tasted like copper. A new figure appeared, masked, towering, dressed in a robe stitched with feathers and teeth. "Let the final seasoning begin," he announced. From all sides, masked figures began throwing herbs, spices, and powders into the pit as if blessing ingredients before cooking. Caribou realized they were the center of the ritual, and whatever test was next wouldn't be about escape. It would be about survival. Daimji suddenly doubled over and began convulsing. His mouth foamed. Sepha screamed but couldn't move, as if her legs had turned to stone. Caribou held them both, shouting into the watching crowd, but no one answered. Their silence was louder than any scream. Then, from beneath the sand, the real challenge, emerged a skeletal creature with limbs like tree roots and eyes that glowed yellow in rhythmic pulses. The crowd began to chant again, not with words but with guttural vibrations that made Caribou's ribs ache. The creature didn't attack immediately. It crawled in slow, deliberate movements, sniffing the air around each of them like it was selecting which course to begin with. Caribou, still gripping the metal rod from earlier, took a defensive stance in front of the others. The creature hissed. Sepha, in a moment of clarity, pulled a tiny blade from her boot. Her boutique wasn't just fashion. After a lance slit her palm, throwing blood into the creature's eyes. It screeched, recoiling, and Caribou seized the moment to strike. Blow after blow landed until the rod snapped. The crowd grew restless. Murmurs became howls. The spotlight spun wildly, and the host stepped forward. Removing his mask to reveal a familiar face, it was the town's mayor. The man who promised to clean up Umuroko, but instead, he'd been feeding it. The mayor raised his hands and the pit walls began to close in. Sand turned to thick mud. Torches burst into blue flame. "Let balance be judged," he declared, eyes glowing like an ancient god. Just then, Daimji stood up, fully upright, possessed, yet stable. But instead of attacking his friends, he turned on the mayor, charging with a strength that didn't belong to him. Something inside Daimji was fighting back, the human part, still buried under layers of transformation. Sepha, weak but aware, joined him, throwing the tiny blade upward with pinpoint aim. It slashed the mayor's face, revealing not flesh but a mask of stretched skin. He wasn't human anymore. He hadn't been for years. The pit cracked. Water gushed from beneath, flooding the chamber. Caribou grabbed his friends, pulling them toward the crumbling wall where light now poured in. The crowd screamed, not in anger, but fear. As the ritual collapsed, their immortality broke with it. They had relied on secrecy, on repetition. But now, someone had survived, and survival ruined the recipe. They weren't prey anymore. They were witnesses. They burst into the surface, like newborns escaping a womb of nightmares. The tunnel behind them caved in with a final roar, sealing away the screams of those still below. Dawn broke over Umuroko town, but nothing about the sun felt warm anymore. Caribou, soaked and bleeding, led the other toward an old taxi rank, where abandoned vehicles lined the dusty lot. Sepha was barely conscious, clutching her wounded hand, while Daimji flickered between blank stares and moments of clarity. No one on the street seemed to notice them, or perhaps they chose not to. That's the danger in places like Umuroko. Too many people had learned how to look away. They found shelter in a mechanic's abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, a place Daimji once used for drone testing. Inside, Caribou locked the doors and searched for anything usable: bandages, fuel, old food. He lit a small fire in an oil drum and watched the smoke curl to the ceiling like lost spirits. For a moment, it was quiet. But survival, they would soon learn, wasn't freedom. The ritual had ended, but something had followed them back. That night, Daimji began scratching symbols into the concrete floor, perfect replicas of the glowing marks they had seen in the pit. He didn't know how he was doing it. His hands moved without his permission. Sepha stared at him, fear rising, like bile, and begged Caribou to do something. Caribou tried to stop him, but Daimji growled, his voice low and layered with something inhuman. Then he collapsed. A dark mist leaked from his nostrils like smoke escaping from boiling oil. The air in the room grew heavy, the shadows twisting unnaturally. The radio in the corner, unplugged, crackled to life. Harvest incomplete. It whispered. 3 must be tasted. The warehouse lights exploded, plunging them into red emergency glow. Karabo realized the ritual wasn't tied to a location, it was tied to them. Once tasted, they could never return to being untouched. Sefa clutched her necklace and cried. Not from pain but from understanding. They hadn't escaped. They had brought the feast with them. Karabo and Sefa carried Daimji to the back room, locking him in as he began to mumble in that ancient tongue. His skin pulsed under the surface, like worms crawling beneath glass. Karabo remembered the symbols the survivor creature had drawn in the control room. He tried replicating them on the walls, using engine oil, sketching protection wards with shaky hands. Sefa, meanwhile, dug through old crates and found a rusted hunting rifle, probably from the warehouse's previous owner. They didn't know if it would help, but fear made people resourceful. Outside, dogs barked non-stop. Birds circled but never landed. The town knew something was wrong. Then came the knocksoft, measured, confident. When Karabo peered through a crack in the door, he saw a woman in a velvet cloak holding a lantern. She was smiling, though her eyes wept blood. Return to the table, she said, without opening her mouth, or the table will come to you. Instead of fleeing, Karabo made a decision that defied every instinct in his bones. He let the woman in. She floated across the floor like mist in human form, touching nothing, but infecting everything. She looked at Sefa, then at Daimji, behind the glass. Only one can be saved, she said, still without speaking. Choose your flavor. Her presence spent time. The fire flickered backward, and the shadows rolled up the walls like paint in rewind. Karabo stepped forward. I choose none, he said inside his mind. The woman tilted her head, amused. Then all will rot. But just as she reached out to touch his chest, Sefa raised the rifle and pulled the trigger. The woman's form exploded not in flesh, but in dust and black feathers that turned to ash mid-air. The warehouse shook. Daimji screamed. The symbols on the wall pulsed violently and then vanished. The curse had been challenged but not broken. The air cleared, but Karabo knew something for certain now. This was no longer about survival. It was about destroying the feast itself at the root. The morning air outside the warehouse hung unnaturally still, as if the city itself were waiting. Umuroko had not slept. News stations reported electrical surges, collapsing buildings, and people disappearing in the night, but no one connected the dots. Karabo did. The ritual wasn't just held in a secret chamber beneath Hush Gardens, it had roots spread like veins through the very soul of the town. As Daimji lay unconscious again, his pulse returning to human rhythm, Karabo scoured the warehouse's files and papers. In a rusted locker, he found a forgotten ledger written in both ancient Nzibiti and modern English. Inside, names of every harvest attendee, stretching back to generations. The mayor's name was listed, so was a retired police chief. Even the founding partner of the Abano Hotel was there. But at the end of the list were 3 freshly written names, Sefa, Daimji, Karabo, next to each name. A blank box awaited a verdict. He realized the ritual hadn't failed. It had paused. It was waiting for them to either surrender or fight. And Karabo had made his choice. They returned to Hush Gardens under the burning noon sun. The once luxurious garden now looked abandoned, its marble cracked and its candles long extinguished, but beneath it, the stairs remained. This time Sefa led the way, armed with salt, herbs, matches, and rage. Daimji followed closely, his eyes still flickering with unnatural glints. Karabo carried the ledger like a weapon, knowing it held the names of everyone who had participated and everyone who had fed on the feast. Down they went again, this time prepared. The chanting started faintly once more, but they no longer trembled. When they reached the pit, it was waiting, smaller now, wounded by their defiance, but still alive. The sand was dry, bones scattered. The mayor's mask lay cracked on the stone. From the shadows emerged one final figure, the original host, the man with silver dreadlocks, his eyes now hollow. You returned, he whispered, voice shaking. You should have stayed seasoned. But Sefa raised a gourd of petrol and poured it across the altar while Karabo began reading names aloud from the ledger. Each name burned like fire through the air. With each name, the pit groaned. As Sefa struck a match and dropped it onto the sand, the flames rose in colors the eye wasn't meant to see: blue, green, violet, and black. Screams erupted, not from mouths but from the very walls. Daimji, suddenly overtaken by a deep force, walked into the center and plunged his hands into the pit, pulling up a glowing stone heart beating, bleeding memory, guilt, and hunger. Karabo shouted for him to stop, but it was too late. Daimji crushed the heart with both fists, and the chamber collapsed with a howl so ancient it made the earth tremble. The fire devoured every relic, every bone, every whisper. The stone thrones melted, the painted portraits cracked, the watching eyes turned to ash. The feast was ending, not paused, not postponed, burned, unforgiven, unredeemed, and in the center of the ruins stood the three of them, breathless, forever changed. Whatever had fed on them would never feed again. A week later, Umuroko returned. To its chaotic normal. Power returned. Streets buzzed. No one spoke of Hush Gardens again because the land itself refused to show where it once stood. It was erased, like a scar that disappeared after surgery. Sefa reopened her boutique. Dimji never touched a computer again but began painting instead portraits of things no one else had seen. Karabo, quiet as ever, carried the ledger with him daily, not as a weapon anymore but a reminder. The final page was still blank. He hadn't written anything yet. Maybe he would someday. Maybe never. But every Friday, the three friends met at the same rooftop lounge. They didn't speak of the feast. They didn't have to. They had walked through hunger's mouth and returned intact. Not untouched, not pure, but whole. And in the silence, between sips of pepper soup and laughter, they knew one thing with quiet certainty. Some invitations must never be accepted and some rituals must be burned at the root. This was all for today. Hope you enjoyed today's story. Let us know where are you watching from in the comments section and subscribe for more.